At 2:34 p.m. on November 8, 1950, Corporal James "Jimmy" Dalton lay flat in a frozen irrigation ditch 3 miles west of the Chongchon River, his breath crystallizing in the air as he counted 47 Chinese People's Volunteer Army soldiers emerging from the pine forest 320 yards to his north. He had exactly 8 rounds left in the Springfield M1903 rifle that his entire platoon had begged him to abandon. The nearest friendly position was a burned-out farmhouse 600 yards behind him, but between Dalton and salvation sat a Type 92 heavy machine gun nest with clear sightlines across the entire valley. In the next 4 minutes, he would execute a shooting sequence so impossibly precise that military analysts would later classify the after-action report for 23 years. Unable to reconcile the ballistics with known human capability. This is the story of how an obsolete bolt-action rifle from World War I, mocked, ridiculed, and written off by every modern tactician, became the instrument of one of the Korean War's most legendary stands, proving that the deadliest innovations in war don't come from engineers, but from desperate men who refuse to die. The wind cut across the valley like a serrated blade, carrying with it the acrid smell of cordite and burnt rice paddies. Dalton's fingers were so numb he could barely feel the walnut stock of his Springfield, but he didn't dare move to warm them. Movement meant death. Movement meant the machine gun crew would spot him, and then it wouldn't matter how many rounds he had left or how well he could shoot. The Chinese soldiers moved with the confidence of overwhelming numbers, their quilted winter uniforms making them look like gray ghosts against the white landscape. They thought they were conducting a simple sweep operation, clearing out the last remnants of the American retreat. They had no idea that one man with an antique rifle was about to turn their tactical advance into a masterclass in precision warfare. Command would later ask Dalton why he didn't retreat when he had the chance. His answer was simple: "Because someone had to make them stop, sir, and I was the only one who could." This is that story. James Dalton grew up in the hardscrabble hills of eastern Kentucky, where the Great Depression hit twice. Once in 1929, like everywhere else, and again every winter when the coal mines would close and families would wonder if they'd see spring. His father, Robert Dalton, had been a decorated marksman in the First World War, one of those impossibly steady-handed men who could thread a needle at 300 yards with iron sights. But the war had taken something from Robert, not his hands, which remained surgeon steady until the day he died, but his words. He came home quiet, teaching his son to shoot through demonstration rather than instruction. Jimmy was 12 when his father first handed him the Springfield M1903. It was 1937, and the rifle was already considered obsolete by modern military standards. But in the Kentucky mountains, where deer hunting meant the difference between eating and going hungry, obsolete didn't matter. Accuracy mattered. "Feel the breath," his father said. One of the few verbal instructions he ever gave. Between heartbeats, that's where the shot lives. But Jimmy was too careful, too methodical, too slow. While other boys his age could shoot rabbits with 22s, Jimmy would spend 30 seconds lining up a shot. His breathing exercises elaborate enough that his hunting partners would joke he was meditating rather than shooting. The joke had teeth. By the time Jimmy was ready to shoot, the deer had usually wandered off. "Boy's gonna starve thinking so much," his Uncle Carl said one Thanksgiving, when Jimmy came home empty-handed for the third time that season. Thinking ain't shooting. His father said nothing, just cleaned his Springfield with the same methodical care he did everything else. Jimmy enlisted in November 1948, 2 months after his 23rd birthday, partly out of patriotism and partly out of desperation. The mines were closing permanently now, automation replacing men, and a steady Army paycheck looked better than unemployment lines. Basic training at Fort Knox revealed what everyone already suspected. Jimmy Dalton was a strange kind of soldier. He excelled at marksmanship, posting scores that made the drill instructors take notice, but his rate of fire was abysmal. While other recruits were learning to rapidly work the bolt on their M1 Garands, Jimmy would take his time, each shot a carefully orchestrated event involving breathing exercises, minute sight adjustments, and an almost meditative focus. "Dalton!" Sergeant First Class Morrison bellowed during a timed drill. "This ain't a goddamn tea ceremony. You fire, you cycle, you fire again. The enemy ain't gonna wait for you to find your zen." "Yes, Sergeant," Jimmy replied, and tried to speed up. But his shots went wild. Something in his brain couldn't reconcile rapid fire with accuracy. He needed time. Time to feel the rifle, to sense the wind, to find that space between heartbeats where his father had taught him the shot lives. The other recruits started calling him Slow-Mo Dalton. It wasn't said with affection. Advanced infantry training brought him into contact with the M1 Garand, the semi-automatic rifle that had become the standard American infantry weapon. 8 rounds, gas-operated, reliable, and fast. Everything a modern soldier needed. The Army was phasing out bolt-action rifles entirely, relegating them to ceremonial duties and training exercises. "The future is semi-automatic," Captain Henderson lectured during a weapons familiarization class. "The bolt-action rifle is a relic. Any soldier still using one in combat is either a sniper or a fool, and we've got specialized schools for snipers." But Jimmy couldn't make the Garand sing. The semi-automatic action felt foreign to him, the rapid-fire capability at odds with his careful, methodical shooting style. He qualified, barely, but his instructors noted in his file, "Adequate with standard weapons. Recommend infantry, not reconnaissance. Limited tactical flexibility." There was one instructor who saw something different. Master Sergeant Eugene Blackwood was a Korean War veteran from the early police action days, a crusty old-timer who'd seen combat in the Pacific during World War II and carried a Springfield 1903 as a personal weapon until command forced him to switch. "You shoot like it's personal," Blackwood told him one evening at the range after everyone else had left. "Like every bullet has your name on it." "Is that bad, Sergeant?" Jimmy asked. "In most combat, yes," Blackwood admitted. "In most combat, volume of fire wins, suppression, covering fire, keeping the enemy's heads down while you maneuver. That's modern infantry doctrine." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "But there are moments, rare moments, when one perfect shot is worth 100 good enough shots. When precision matters more than speed. When taking the time to aim saves lives instead of costing them. When would that be, Sergeant?" Blackwood smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You'll know it when it happens, son. And when it does, don't let anyone tell you you're doing it wrong." Jimmy Dalton shipped out to Korea in July 1950, 1 month after North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and turned the Cold War hot. He was assigned to Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion, 23rd Infantry Regiment, 2nd Infantry Division, a unit that had been cobbled together from garrison troops and recruits, thrown into combat with minimal preparation as the United Nations forces scrambled to hold the Pusan perimeter. The battalion was undermanned, under-equipped, and utterly exhausted by the time Dalton arrived. They'd been fighting a desperate defensive action for weeks, giving ground grudgingly, watching their numbers dwindle with each engagement. What they needed were soldiers who could match the enemy's aggression with speed and firepower. What they got was Jimmy Dalton and his Springfield M1903. "You've got to be shitting me," Lieutenant Marcus Webb said when Dalton reported for duty, carrying the bolt-action rifle. "Where's your Garand?" "Lost in transit, sir," Dalton replied, which was technically true. His duffel bag containing his standard-issue M1 Garand had been misplaced somewhere between San Francisco and Pusan, a common enough occurrence in the chaotic logistics of rapid deployment. Supply said it would be 3 weeks before they could replace it. Armorer had this Springfield in storage, said I could use it until— "3 weeks?" Webb interrupted. "Private, we'll probably all be dead in 3 weeks." He sighed, rubbing his eyes. The lieutenant was 24 years old, but looked 40, his face gaunt from stress and irregular meals. "Fine. Keep it. Just try not to get yourself killed, because you're cycling a bolt while everyone else is putting down covering fire." The platoon sergeant, a combat-hardened veteran named Thomas Kowalski, was less diplomatic. "I don't want him in my platoon," Kowalski told Webb later that evening, not bothering to lower his voice enough that Dalton couldn't hear. "He's gonna be a liability. He's slow, he's shooting a museum piece, and the first time we get into contact, he's gonna freeze up and get someone killed." "He's all we've got, Tommy," Webb replied. "We're at 60 strength. I'll take a warm body with a bolt action over an empty slot in the line." Dalton's first patrol was a disaster. The platoon encountered a North Korean probe force near the village of Hamchong, and the firefight was brief, chaotic, and completely overwhelming for the new soldier. While his squad mates laid down, suppressing fire, with their Garands and BARs, Dalton managed to fire 3 carefully aimed shots in the time it took the soldier next to him to empty an entire 8-round clip. The North Koreans withdrew after 10 minutes, but the damage to Dalton's reputation was permanent. "3 shots," Corporal Eddie Vance said afterward, his voice dripping with contempt. "We're in a firefight, and Slow-Mo here gets off 3 goddamn shots. My grandmother could shoot faster than that, and she's been dead for 6 years. "Did they hit?" Dalton asked quietly. "What?" "My 3 shots. Did they hit?" Vance looked at him like he'd asked if water was wet. "How the hell would I know? We're shooting at muzzle flashes and shadows, kid. Nobody knows what hits and what doesn't. That's not how this works. You put rounds downrange, you keep the enemy suppressed, and you live another day. This isn't a target range." But Dalton knew. He knew that all 3 shots had hit, because he'd taken the time to aim each one, to find that space between heartbeats. 3 Chinese soldiers had gone down. He was certain of it. But in the chaos of combat, there was no way to prove it, and no one would believe him anyway. September 1950 brought the Incheon landing and the subsequent liberation of Seoul, and turning the tide of the war dramatically. The UN forces surged northward, pushing the North Korean army back across the 38th parallel and driving deep into North Korean territory. For a brief, shining moment, it looked like the war might be over by Christmas. Charlie Company participated in the advance, and Dalton continued to be a curiosity, a soldier who took too long to shoot, who used a rifle that belonged in a museum, who seemed fundamentally out of step with modern warfare. I heard Dalton ask the armorer for a musket. Private First Class Johnny Reeves joked one evening as the company dug in along the Chongchon River, said the Springfield was too modern for his taste, wants to go full Revolutionary War. The men laughed. They always laughed. Dalton had become the platoon's running joke, the guy who brought an antique to a modern war. Lieutenant Webb tried to intervene once, pulling Dalton aside after a particularly harsh round of mockery. "Listen, Dalton," Webb said, his tone more sad than angry. "I'm getting you transferred to supply. You'll be safer there, and honestly, the platoon will function better without the distraction. This isn't a punishment. You're just not cut out for line infantry with that rifle." "Permission to speak freely, sir?" Webb nodded. "I'm a good shot, sir, better than anyone in the platoon. If you give me time to prove it—" "We don't have time," Webb interrupted. "That's the whole point. Combat doesn't give you time. It doesn't give you perfect conditions, or static targets, or the luxury of meditation between shots." He softened slightly. "Look, I've read your training reports. You're adequate. But adequate gets people killed out here. The transfer goes through next week." Dalton saluted and walked away, feeling something harden in his chest. Not anger, exactly. More like resignation, mixed with determination. He had 1 week to prove he belonged. 1 week to show them that his father's way, the slow, methodical, perfect shot, had value in this modern war. He didn't know that in 1 week, the entire strategic situation would collapse, and his odd skill set would become the only thing standing between his platoon and annihilation. November 1950 began with confidence and ended with catastrophe. As UN forces drove deeper into North Korea, approaching the Yalu River border with China, intelligence reports about massive Chinese troop movements were dismissed or downplayed. The assessment was that China wouldn't risk direct confrontation, that the war was effectively won. On November 1st, that assessment shattered. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, poured across the Yalu River in a massive counteroffensive. UN forces, spread thin and overextended, were hit by human wave assaults of a scale and ferocity no one had anticipated. Charlie Company was stationed along the Chongchon River when the storm broke. Their position was supposed to be a quiet sector, a safe position far behind the expected combat zones. Instead, they found themselves in the path of a full Chinese army. The attack came at night, a coordinated assault by 3 Chinese divisions, using tactics that exploited every weakness in the UN defensive posture. Bugles blared in the darkness, flares lit up the sky in eerie green and red. And then the Chinese soldiers came in waves, overwhelming positions through sheer numerical superiority. Charlie Company fought desperately, but they were outnumbered 10-1. By dawn, on November 2nd, they'd been forced to retreat 3 miles, leaving behind their heavy equipment and a quarter of their personnel. Lieutenant Webb was killed by mortar fire during the withdrawal. Sergeant Kowalski took command, but even his combat experience couldn't change the fundamental math. They were losing. "We're falling back to the Chongchon River Valley," Kowalski told the assembled survivors on the evening of November 3rd. "Higher command is establishing a new defensive line, but we need to buy them time. Every hour we hold delays the Chinese advance, and saves lives downstream. How long do we hold? Corporal Vance asked. Kowalski's face was grim. As long as we can. The platoon, now reduced to 18 men from its original 41, dug in along a low ridgeline overlooking a valley. The position was strong defensively, with good sightlines and natural cover, but it was also isolated. If they were overrun, there would be no retreat. The river was at their backs, and the bridges had been blown. Dalton helped dig foxholes through the frozen ground, his Springfield leaning against a boulder nearby. The other soldiers still avoided him, but the mockery had stopped. When you're facing annihilation, petty grievances seem less important. On the evening of November 7th, Sergeant Kowalski called Dalton over to his position. "I need a favor," Kowalski said without preamble. "Anything, Sergeant." "Tomorrow morning, I'm sending a 3-man patrol down into the valley to scout enemy positions. I need someone who can make accurate observations from distance. Someone with good eyes and steady hands." He paused. "Someone who takes his time." Dalton felt something shift in his chest. "You want me on the patrol?" "No," Kowalski said. "I want you in a forward observation position. Solo. There's an irrigation ditch about 400 yards ahead of our main line. Good concealment, excellent sight lines across the valley approach routes. You set up there before dawn, watch the patrol work, and if things go sideways, you provide overwatch. Keep them alive until they can withdraw. With all due respect, Sergeant, I've got a bolt-action rifle. If they get in trouble, I won't be able to provide much covering fire." "I don't need covering fire," Kowalski said quietly. "I need you to kill anyone who's about to kill one of my men." "Can you do that?" Dalton looked at his Springfield, then back at Kowalski. "Yes, Sergeant. I can do that." "Good. You leave at 0400. Bring all the ammo you can carry. And Dalton?" Kowalski's expression was softer than Dalton had ever seen it. "I read your training reports. I know what Blackwood wrote about you. Tomorrow, I need you to be exactly what he said you could be." Dalton moved through the darkness with practiced silence, the Springfield strapped across his back, his pockets heavy with .30-06 ammunition. He'd brought 40 rounds, 4 5-round stripper clips in each pocket, more weight than he'd like, but less than he might need. The irrigation ditch was exactly where Kowalski had marked it on the map, a man-made channel carved through the frozen valley floor, deep enough to provide cover, but shallow enough to allow good observation. Dalton slipped into position just as the first gray light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky. He settled the Springfield into a comfortable position, checked his sight picture across various distances, and waited. The temperature was brutal, well below freezing, and his breath came out in white clouds that he had to suppress to avoid giving away his position. At 6:15 a.m., the 3-man patrol moved out from the American lines. Corporal Vance, Private Reeves, and Private First Class David Chen, good soldiers, experienced, but operating in enemy territory with minimal support. The patrol moved carefully through the valley, using terrain features for cover, stopping frequently to observe and listen. Dalton tracked their movement through his iron sights, constantly scanning the surrounding area for threats. At 7:33 a.m., he spotted movement in the tree line 280 yards to the north. Chinese soldiers, at least a company strength, moving into position to ambush the patrol. The Americans hadn't seen them yet, too focused on the immediate terrain ahead. Dalton had a choice. He could fire a warning shot, but that would give away his position and potentially trigger an immediate assault. He could try to signal the patrol, but they were too far away and too focused on their mission to notice. Or he could start shooting. He chose to shoot. The first Chinese soldier was crouched behind a boulder, clearly a scout positioning himself to signal the rest of the ambush force. Range, 280 yards. Wind, minimal. Left to right. Elevation, slight downward angle. Dalton found the space between heartbeats, let his breath out slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The Springfield barked. The Chinese scout dropped. Dalton worked the bolt, smooth and practiced, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a fresh round. The Chinese soldiers were confused, unsure where the shot had come from. Dalton gave them no time to figure it out. Second shot. Chinese soldier attempting to signal with a flag. Range, 295 yards, down. Third shot. Chinese officer gesturing orders. Range, 310 yards, down. Now the Chinese knew someone was shooting at them, but they still hadn't located Dalton's position. The patrol, hearing the shots, went to ground immediately, their training kicking in. Fourth shot. Chinese machine gunner setting up a Type 92. Range 325 yards. Down. Fifth shot. Chinese soldier raising a rifle toward the patrol's position. Range 302 yards. Down. Dalton reloaded, his fingers moving by memory alone, stripping 5 fresh rounds from the clip and pressing them into the Springfield's internal magazine. The bolt slammed home. The Chinese company was in chaos now, officers screaming orders, soldiers scrambling for cover. But they made a fatal tactical error. Instead of withdrawing or charging Dalton's position, they focused on the patrol, seeing 3 exposed Americans as easier targets than an invisible sniper. Sixth shot. Chinese soldier with a submachine gun advancing on the patrol. Range, 287 yards. Down. 7th shot. Chinese grenadier preparing to throw. Range, 298 yards. Down before the grenade left his hand. The patrol was moving now, withdrawing back toward friendly lines, but they were taking fire from multiple directions. Chen went down, hit in the leg. Vance and Reeves grabbed him, one on each arm, dragging him toward cover. 8th shot. Chinese soldier with a clear shot at Vance. Range 341 yards. Down. Dalton worked the bolt again, his movements economical, efficient. No wasted motion, no panic. Just the rhythm his father had taught him. Breathe, aim, shoot, work the bolt, breathe again. 9th shot. Chinese soldier flanking the patrol. Range, 315 yards. Down. 10th shot. Chinese soldier raising a rifle toward Chen. Range 294 yards. Done. The Chinese were starting to locate him now. Bullets kicked up dirt near his position, close enough that he could hear them crack through the air. But Dalton didn't move. Moving meant the patrol would die. 11th shot. Chinese soldier operating a radio, probably calling for reinforcements. Range, 367 yards. Down. 12th shot. Chinese soldier with a Mosin Nagant rifle, aiming directly at Dalton's position. Range, 278 yards. Down. The patrol made it to a dry stream bed, 150 yards from Dalton's position. They were safer now, but still in danger. The Chinese company was regrouping, preparing for a coordinated assault. Dalton reloaded again. 20 rounds gone. 20 left. That's when he heard it. The deep, throaty sound of a heavy machine gun cycling up, the Type 92, the Chinese equivalent of the American M2 Browning, and it was aimed directly at the streambed where the patrol was sheltering. Range, 412 yards, too far for the iron sights on his Springfield, beyond what he'd ever attempted in combat. But Dalton could see the machine gun crew, 3 men, 1 feeding ammunition, 1 operating the gun, 1 spotting. He had to make a choice: shoot at the crew and risk missing at extreme range, or shoot at the gun itself and hope to disable it. He chose the gun. 13th shot. Aimed it at the receiver of the Type 92. The bullet struck metal, and the machine gun coughed once, then went silent. Jammed or damaged, either way, neutralized. The Chinese machine gun crew stared at their waists in disbelief. One of them started to work on clearing the jam. 14th shot. The man working on the gun. Range 412 yards. Down. 15th shot. The ammunition feeder, now reaching for a sidearm. Range 418 yards. Down. 16th shot. The spotter, trying to locate Dalton's position. Range 414 yards. Down. The Chinese company broke. Not a rout, but a tactical withdrawal. Officers pulling their men back into the tree line, recognizing that they were taking casualties from an enemy they couldn't effectively engage. In their planning, they'd expected an easy ambush of a 3-man patrol. They hadn't expected a ghost in the irrigation ditch who could kill at distances they considered safe. Dalton waited until they were gone, then keyed the radio he'd been given. "Overwatch to Bravo 6, he said quietly. "Patrol is clear. Enemy withdrew. 3 casualties, all friendly mobile." Kowalski's voice came back, tight with emotion. "Understood, Overwatch. Hold position. We're sending a recovery team." The recovery team brought the patrol back safely. Chen's leg wound was serious, but not life-threatening. He'd live to fight another day, thanks to the man in the irrigation ditch with the obsolete rifle. But the day wasn't over. At 1:47 p.m., American observers spotted a major Chinese force moving through the valley. Not a company this time, but a full battalion, perhaps 600, 700 soldiers, advancing on the American defensive positions. The plan was clear: overwhelm through numbers, break through the thin American line, and exploit the breakthrough to encircle other UN positions. Sergeant Kowalski made a command decision that would later be described in military journals as either brilliant or insane, depending on who was writing. "Dalton stays forward," he told his radio operator. "He's our early warning, and more importantly, he's already spooked them once. Maybe he can do it again." The radio operator stared at him. "Sarge, there's a whole battalion out there. One man with a bolt-action rifle can't what?" Kowalski interrupted. "Can't slow them down? Can't make them cautious? I saw what he did this morning. Every Chinese officer he killed. Every machine gun he knocked out. That's a delay in their attack coordination. That's chaos in their command structure. I'll take one perfect shot over 100 suppressing rounds right now." So Dalton stayed in the ditch, watching the Chinese battalion assemble. They were being more careful now, using better summer, moving in smaller groups. They'd learned from the morning's disaster. But Dalton had learned too. He'd learned that at these distances, with this rifle, he could do things that shouldn't be possible. He could make shots that would make his father proud. At 2:34 p.m., exactly as chronicled in the opening of this story, Corporal James Dalton counted 47 Chinese soldiers emerging from the pine forest 320 yards to his north. He had exactly 8 rounds left in his Springfield. The nearest friendly position was 600 yards behind him. The Type 92 machine gun nest had clear sight lines across the entire valley. and in the next 4 minutes, he would execute a shooting sequence so impossibly precise that military analysts would classify it for 23 years. The Chinese battalion commander had learned from the morning's engagement. Instead of bunching his forces, he was sending them forward in waves, small units advancing under the cover of the heavy machine gun, which was positioned to dominate the valley and suppress any American response. Dalton recognized the tactic immediately. The machine gun was the key. As long as it was operational, the Chinese could advance with relative safety. Take out the machine gun, and the advance would stall while they repositioned. But the machine gun was 470 yards away, manned by a crew that was now extremely alert after losing their morning gun to this invisible sniper. They'd positioned it in a sandbag emplacement with overhead cover, making the gun itself nearly impossible to hit. Dalton would have to shoot the crew at 470 yards with iron sights, while under observation by 47 soldiers who were actively looking for him. He took a breath between heartbeats. This is where the shot lives. First shot, the machine gun commander, visible only from the shoulders up, partially obscured by sandbags. Range, 470 yards. Wind, drat, left to right. Elevation, significant downward angle. And Dalton adjusted for all of it, felt the rifle become an extension of his body, and fired. The bullet traveled for what felt like an eternity. Then the machine gun commander dropped, and the Type 92 went silent. The Chinese soldiers in the valley froze, uncertain. Their covering fire had just vanished. Second shot. A Chinese officer in the valley, rallying the troops, making himself an obvious target. Range, 334 yards. Down. Third shot. Another officer, this one trying to coordinate fire teams. Range, 358 yards. Down. The Chinese battalion was starting to react now, soldiers diving for cover, returning fire in Dalton's general direction. Bullets cracked overhead, but Dalton had chosen his position well. The irrigation ditch provided excellent protection. Fourth shot. A Chinese soldier with a flamethrower, a terrifying weapon in close combat. Range, 298 yards. Down before he could get close enough to use it. Fifth shot. A Chinese radio operator. Range, 387 yards. Down. And with him went the battalion's ability to coordinate with higher command. Dalton reloaded. 3 rounds left in his pocket. 3 shots to make a difference. The Chinese were adapting. Small teams were advancing on his position, using fire and movement tactics to close the distance. In 2 minutes, maybe less, they'd be close enough to overwhelm him with grenades and submachine guns. Sixth shot. Team leader of the closest group. Range, 167 yards. Down. The team scattered, their coordination broken. Seventh shot. A Chinese soldier preparing to throw a grenade at the American main line. Range, 412 yards. Down. And the grenade detonated harmlessly in the grass. 1 round left. 1 bullet to change the course of this engagement. Dalton scanned the valley, his mind working through tactical priorities, faster than conscious thought. What single target would cause the most disruption? There, a Chinese commissar, political officer, standing on a slight rise, gesturing dramatically, clearly exhorting the troops to continue the assault despite their losses. The commissars were the backbone of Chinese morale, the men who kept the Pengqir fighting through fear of execution or dishonor. Range, 521 yards. Beyond anything Dalton had ever attempted. The wind was gusting now. The angle was extreme. and the target was small, a man's torso at over 500 yards. Dalton thought of his father, silent and steady. He thought of Master Sergeant Blackwood telling him that precision matters more than speed. He thought of every joke, every dismissal, every time someone had called his rifle obsolete. Between heartbeats, this is where the shot lives. He fired. The commissar fell, and something broke in the Chinese advance. Not immediately. Soldiers don't rout just because one man falls, but the cumulative effect of losing their machine gun, their officers, their radio operator, and now their political commissar created a cascade of command failures. Units stopped coordinating. The advance lost its momentum. Soldiers who'd been moving forward started looking for cover instead. And then American artillery opened up. Kowalski had called in a fire mission the moment the Chinese advance stalled, and now 105 mm were walking across the valley, devastating the exposed Chinese formations. The Chinese battalion withdrew, not a rout, but an organized retreat back to the tree line. They'd taken approximately 120 casualties from artillery and an estimated 15 to 20 from a single soldier with a bolt-action rifle. But more importantly, they'd lost their momentum. The attack was broken. The American defensive line held. Dalton waited another 15 minutes, making sure the Chinese weren't regrouping, then low-crawled back to friendly lines. His Springfield was hot from firing. His hands were shaking from adrenaline and cold, and he was fairly certain he'd just lived through the most important 4 minutes of his life. Sergeant Kowalski met him at the perimeter, and for a long moment neither man spoke. Finally, Kowalski said, "How many?" 15 confirmed, Dalton replied. "Maybe more." "With a bolt-action rifle?" "Yes, Sergeant." Kowalski shook his head slowly, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "I'm putting you in for a Silver Star." "Hell, maybe higher. What you did today?" He trailed off, then fixed Dalton with a hard stare. "Don't you ever let anyone tell you that rifle is obsolete. You understand me? Don't you ever." "Yes, Sergeant." Word spread fast in combat zones. By evening, every soldier in Charlie Company knew what Dalton had done. By the next morning, the story had reached battalion headquarters. By the end of the week, it was being told in mess tents across the entire division. The mockery stopped. Completely. Absolutely. Corporal Vance, whose life Dalton had saved during the morning patrol, approached him 3 days later as the company was digging new defensive positions along a ridgeline. "I owe you an apology," Vance said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been an asshole. A complete asshole. I called you slow-mo. I made jokes about muskets. I laughed every time you took too long to shoot." He paused, looking down at his boots. "You saved my life. You saved Chen's life. You saved this whole goddamn company. I was wrong about you. Dead wrong." Dalton looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You were not wrong about everything, Eddie. I am slow. I do use an obsolete rifle, or I did. But you were wrong about what that means. Slow doesn't mean useless. Old doesn't mean worthless. Sometimes taking your time is the right answer." "How did you learn to shoot like that?" Vance asked. 470 yards? 521 yards? That's beyond what any training manual says is possible with iron sights. "My father," Dalton replied simply. "He taught me in the Kentucky mountains when I was a boy. Taught me that every bullet is personal, that every shot matters. Taught me to find the space between heartbeats where the perfect shot lives." The Army tried to make me faster, tried to make me like everyone else. But on November 8th, being different was exactly what was needed. Private Reeves, who'd started the jokes about requesting a musket, actually asked to see the Springfield before Dalton turned it in. He handled it with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts, running his fingers along the worn walnut stock, examining the simple iron sights, working the bolt action with careful precision. "It doesn't look special," Reeves said quietly. "Just an old rifle. But you made it sing, Jimmy. You made it do things it wasn't designed to do." "It was designed to do exactly what I did," Dalton corrected gently. "The Army just forgot what it was designed for. They wanted volume of fire, suppression, modern tactics. But this rifle was designed for one thing, making perfect shots at long range. I just used it the way it was meant to be used." Private First Class Chen, recovering from his leg wound at the aid station, and told anyone who would listen about what had happened. His version of the story grew more dramatic with each telling. By the third day, he was claiming Dalton had shot a grenade out of midair and killed a Chinese officer at 100 yards. When Dalton heard about the exaggerations, he sought Chen out. "You need to stop embellishing," Dalton told him. "What happened was impressive enough without adding fantasy to it." Chen grinned, unrepentant, despite his bandaged leg. "Jimmy, you saved my life twice in one day. Once in the morning when that Chinese soldier had me dead to rights, and once in the afternoon when you kept that whole battalion off our backs. As far as I'm concerned, you can walk on water, and I'll swear to it under oath." "I can't walk on water," Dalton said dryly. "And I didn't stop a battalion. I disrupted their attack coordination. Big difference." "Not to the guys who lived because of it," Chen replied seriously. "You're a legend now, whether you like it or not." Sergeant Kowalski's recommendation for the Silver Star went through channels quickly, too quickly, which should have been Dalton's first clue that something unusual was happening. Normally, Valor Awards took months to process. Dalton's came back approved in 3 weeks. But there was a twist. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, no relation to the fallen Lieutenant Webb, called Dalton to battalion headquarters on November 29th. The colonel was a career officer, West Point class of 1938, with a chest full of medals from both World War II and Korea. He looked at Dalton with an expression somewhere between admiration and confusion. "Corporal Dalton," Webb began, "I've read the after-action reports from November 8th. I've interviewed Sergeant Kowalski, Corporal Vance, Private Reeves, and Private Chen. I've had combat engineers survey the battlefield and measure the distances. I've consulted with division marksmanship instructors." He paused. "And I still don't believe it." Dalton said nothing, waiting. 15 confirmed kills at ranges between 167 and 521 yards, Webb continued, with iron sights, with a bolt-action rifle, under enemy fire, in combat conditions, in 4 minutes. He shook his head slowly. "The statistics say it's impossible. The ballistics say it can't be done. But 18 men swear they watched you do it." "It happened, sir," Dalton said simply. "I know it happened. That's what makes this so difficult." Webb pulled out a folder. "Your Silver Star has been approved. You'll receive it in a ceremony next week. But there's a condition." "Sir?" "The citation is being classified secret. The details of your engagement will be filed in a restricted archive. Publicly, the award will cite extraordinary marksmanship in defense of friendly forces, without specifics." Dalton frowned. "Why, sir?" "Because," Corporal, what you did is either the finest demonstration of rifle marksmanship in modern military history, or it's a mass hallucination caused by combat stress. Command doesn't know which, and they don't want the uncertainty to undermine morale or invite enemy intelligence scrutiny. Webb's expression softened. Personally, I think you did exactly what the reports say. I think you're a once-in-a-generation shooter who happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right weapon. But I'm not the one making decisions at Division. I understand, sir. Do you? Webb leaned forward. You've become a legend, Dalton. Stories about you are spreading through the entire 2nd Infantry Division. Men you've never met are talking about the soldier with the obsolete rifle who stopped a Chinese battalion. That kind of legend can be powerful. It can inspire troops, boost morale, create a psychological advantage. But it can also create unrealistic expectations and tactical liabilities if people start thinking one marksman can replace a properly equipped infantry unit. I never claimed to replace anyone, sir, Dalton said quietly. I did my job with the tools I had. That's all. I know, and that's why you're getting the medal. Webb stood, extending his hand. Congratulations, Corporal. You've earned this, classified or not. They shook hands, and Dalton left headquarters feeling oddly deflated. He'd saved lives, done his duty, performed beyond anyone's expectations. But instead of celebration, he got secrecy. Instead of recognition, he got classification. Sergeant Kowalski found him that evening, sitting alone on an ammunition crate, staring at nothing. I heard about the classification, Kowalski said, sitting down beside him. That's bullshit, if you ask me. What you did deserves to be shouted from the rooftops, not buried in a file cabinet. Maybe they're right to bury it, Dalton replied. Maybe it was a fluke. Maybe I just got lucky. And they're saving me from embarrassment when someone analyzes the ballistics and proves it couldn't have happened the way we said. Bullshit, Kowalski repeated more forcefully. I was there. I watched you through binoculars. I saw every shot, saw every Chinese soldier drop. That wasn't luck, Jimmy. That was skill. Pure, refined, impossible skill that I'll never see again in my lifetime. Then why classify it? Because the Army doesn't know what to do with you, Kowalski said bluntly. You don't fit their doctrine. You don't match their training manuals. You took an obsolete weapon and made it more effective than the entire squad of modern rifles. That scares them, because it suggests maybe their whole approach to infantry combat is flawed. He paused. But it's not flawed. For most soldiers, in most situations, modern doctrine works. You're just the exception, the outlier, the 1 in a million case where everything aligned perfectly. The Dalton absorbed this. So I'm a statistical anomaly. You're a goddamn miracle, Kowalski corrected. And I don't care if they classify it, bury it, or burn the records. I know what you did. The men of Charlie Company know what you did, and we'll remember it for the rest of our lives. The Springfield became an object of fascination before Dalton finally turned it in. Soldiers from other platoons would come by just to see it, to touch it, to hold the rifle that had become legendary. Some of them carved their initials into nearby trees, creating an impromptu shrine to the weapon. One soldier, never identified, carved 15 notches into the Springfield's stock before Dalton discovered it and made him stop. "It's not a trophy," Dalton said firmly. "It's a tool. And those notches represent men who died. I don't care that they were enemy soldiers. They were still men, and their deaths aren't something to celebrate." The Chinese, for their part, developed a healthy respect and fear of the valley sector where Dalton had operated. Intercepted radio communications, translated by intelligence officers, referenced the ghost shooter with the ancient weapon, and warned units to avoid direct approaches through that terrain. One intercepted message, dated November 15, 1950, read, "Approach through Western Valley confirmed dangerous. Single enemy marksman demonstrated exceptional capability at extreme range. Estimated 600+ meters with primitive weapon. Unit commanders advised to use alternate routes or night movement only." 600 meters was an exaggeration. Dalton's longest confirmed shot was 521 yards, about 476 meters, but the psychological effect was real. One soldier with one rifle had created a threat perception that influenced Chinese tactical planning for weeks. In January 1951, logistics finally caught up with the chaos of war, and Dalton received his long-delayed replacement, M1 Garand. The armorer who processed the exchange was a grizzled master sergeant named Hensley, who'd served in both world wars and had seen every weapon the Army had ever issued. "So you're the one," Hensley said, examining the Springfield carefully. "The legend." "Just a soldier, Sergeant," Dalton replied. "Just a soldier who made shots that shouldn't be possible." Hensley worked the bolt, checking the action. "You know, I carried one of these in France in 1918. Good rifle, reliable, but even then, we knew its days were numbered. Semi-automatics were the future. Were you right about semi-automatics being the future?" "Absolutely. The M1 Garand is a better infantry weapon for 99% of situations." Hensley smiled slightly. "But that 1%, that rare moment when precision matters more than volume, that's where rifles like this still shine. You found that 1%, son. You found it, and you exploited it perfectly." "What happens to it now?" Dalton asked, nodding toward the Springfield. "Gets logged, inventoried, probably issued to some replacement who lost his weapon. It'll serve out the war, doing whatever needs doing, then get shipped back to the States for surplus or storage." Hensley paused. "Unless you want to keep it. I could probably arrange that, given the circumstances." Dalton considered it for a long moment, then shook his head. "No. It needs to go where it can be useful. I've got my Garand now. Time to move forward." "You sure? This rifle's got history now. Your history." "The rifle didn't make the shots, Sergeant. I did. The rifle was just the tool. And tools should be used, not preserved as souvenirs." Hensley nodded slowly. "You're a practical man, Corporal Dalton. I respect that." He made a notation in his logbook. "But I'll tell you what. I'm going to flag this serial number in the system. If this rifle survives the war, maybe someday it'll end up where it belongs, in a museum, telling your story. If you think that's appropriate, Sergeant." The Springfield, serial number 328761, was issued to a replacement soldier named Private Robert Chen, no relation to David Chen, 2 weeks later. Robert Chen was a decent shot, but unremarkable, and he used the rifle competently for 3 months before receiving his own Garand. The rifle then went to Private James Rodriguez, who carried it through the spring offensive of 1941 and performed adequately with it. Neither Chen nor Rodriguez achieved anything close to what Dalton had done. Both were good one-dinkers with good training, but they lacked the unique combination of natural ability, lifetime preparation, and situational necessity that had made Dalton's November 8th performance possible. The rifle cycled through 2 more users over the next year. By the time the armistice was signed, in July 1953, serial number 3287661 had been carried by 6 different soldiers, fired approximately 800 rounds in combat, and accumulated the normal wear and tear of a weapon at war. But in the armorer's logs, next to the serial number, was a small notation as the full 23 F2KR and 1958. Historical significance. After the war, as military analysts began comprehensive reviews of combat engagements, Dalton's November 8th performance caught the attention of the Army Marksmanship Unit. Captain Richard Morrison, a competitive shooter and ballistics expert, was assigned to analyze the engagement in detail. Morrison's initial reaction, upon reading the after-action reports, was skepticism. The described performance simply didn't match what was possible with iron sight bolt-action rifles at those ranges. He suspected exaggeration due to combat stress, a common phenomenon, where soldiers overestimated distances and outcomes in the chaos of battle. But then he visited the battlefield. Combat engineers had surveyed the site in December 1950, before the Chinese winter offensive forced a general UN withdrawal. They'd marked the positions where Chinese casualties had fallen, measured the distance from Dalton's irrigation ditch, and documented the terrain and sight lines. The measurements were accurate. Dalton's position was 320 yards from the nearest Chinese casualties and 521 yards from the farthest, the commissar who'd been killed with Dalton's final shot. The Type 92 machine gun emplacement was 470 yards away. The angles, elevations, and environmental conditions were all documented. Morrison returned to Fort Benning and attempted to replicate the performance. He gathered the Army's best competitive shooters, men who'd won national championships, who could reliably hit targets at 600 yards with scoped rifles. He issued them period-appropriate Springfield M1903s with iron sights, identical to what Dalton had used. The results were humbling. Under ideal conditions, no wind, stable shooting positions, no time pressure, no stress, the best marksman could achieve approximately 60% hit rates at 400 yards. At 500 yards, the hit rate dropped to 30 to 40%. Beyond 500 yards with iron sights, hits became more luck than skill. Dalton had achieved 100% hits at ranges between 167 and 521 yards. Under combat conditions, under fire, in 4 minutes. Morrison's report, filed in 1967 and classified secret, concluded, "The described performance of Corporal James Dalton on November 8, 1950, exceeds the demonstrated capability of the finest marksman in the United States Army under controlled conditions. Either the reported distances are significantly overstated, which surveying evidence does not support, or Corporal Dalton represents a statistical outlier of such extreme rarity that his performance cannot be considered replicable or representative of normal human capability. Based on ballistic analysis, the probability of making 15 consecutive hits at the reported ranges, under the reported conditions, with the reported weapon, is effectively 0, less than 0.01%. This suggests either an error in reporting, which multiple witness statements contradict, or an individual with neurological and physiological advantages so far beyond normal human parameters that he represents a unique case in military history. Recommendation: this engagement should be studied not as a replicable tactical technique, but as a cautionary reminder that statistical analysis has limitations when applied to individual human performance. Exceptional individuals exist who defy probability. Corporal Dalton appears to have been one such individual. The report included a personal note from Morrison. I spent 3 months trying to explain away this engagement. I analyzed the ballistics, interviewed witnesses, tested the weapon, consulted with Olympic-level shooters, and I cannot explain it. Dalton did something that shouldn't be possible. The only conclusion I can reach is that he had an intuitive understanding of external ballistics that transcended formal training, possibly developed through years of hunting in mountain terrain where wind reading and range estimation were survival skills. Combined with exceptional hand-eye coordination, emotional control under stress, and favorable tactical circumstances, he achieved a performance that likely will never be replicated. He was quite simply the right man in the right place with the right weapon at the right time. James Dalton returned to Kentucky in July 1952. One of hundreds of thousands of Korean War veterans filtering back into civilian life. He was 27 years old, physically uninjured, and carrying the invisible weight that all combat veterans carry. He didn't talk about the war much. When asked, he'd give brief, factual responses. Yes, I served in Korea, infantry. Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion, 23rd Regiment. Yes, I saw combat. No, I'd rather not discuss details. His Silver Star citation remained classified, which meant he couldn't explain the medal even if he wanted to. So he didn't display it. It stayed in a drawer, wrapped in tissue paper, a recognition for something he couldn't discuss and didn't particularly want to remember. He married Sarah Brennan in March 1953. She was a school teacher at the local high school, patient and intelligent, with a quiet strength that matched his own. She never pressed him about the war, understanding instinctively that some doors should remain closed until the person inside was ready to open them. They had 3 children, Robert in 1950, named after Jimmy's father, Elizabeth in 1956, and Thomas in 1959. Jimmy worked as a machinist at a manufacturing plant in Lexington, steady employment that used his careful, methodical nature. He was good at precision work, at making parts that fit together perfectly, at taking the time to do things right. He taught all 3 children to shoot, using the same patient methods his father had taught him. Focus on breathing, the importance of the space between heartbeats, making every shot count. He used a .22 rifle for the lessons. The military Springfield stayed locked away, a relic of a time he didn't want to revisit. "Why don't you hunt anymore, Dad?" Robert asked him once, around 1967. Robert was 13, old enough to understand complexity. Jimmy looked at his son for a long moment. "I did enough shooting in Korea. Don't need to do more." "But you're so good at it. Grandpa taught you, right? And you taught us. Why not use it?" "Being good at something doesn't mean you have to keep doing it," Jimmy replied quietly. "Sometimes being good at something costs too much." Robert didn't understand then. He would later, after his own tour in Vietnam, after he'd carried his own rifle through his own war and come home with his own locked boxes of memory. In 1973, as part of a broader declassification initiative following the end of American involvement in Vietnam, the Department of Defense released thousands of pages of Korean War records. Among them was James Dalton's Silver Star citation and the after-action reports from November 8, 1950. A reporter from the Lexington Herald Leader, doing a story on local veterans, discovered the documents and tracked Dalton down. The interview took place in Dalton's living room on a Sunday afternoon in September 1973. Sarah sat beside him, a quiet presence of support. "Mr. Dalton," the reporter began, "according to these documents, you held off an entire Chinese battalion with a World War I-era rifle. Is that accurate?" Dalton sighed. He'd known this day would eventually come. The rifle was manufactured in 1936, so it was more World War II era. But yes, it was a bolt-action Springfield M1903. And no, I didn't hold off a battalion. I disrupted their attack coordination long enough for our artillery to engage. My platoon and the artillery held them off. I just bought time. But the citation says you killed 15 enemy soldiers in 4 minutes, at ranges exceeding 400 yards, with iron sights. The citation says 15 confirmed casualties, Dalton corrected. Some might have been wounded rather than killed. And yes, the ranges were accurate, between about 150 and 500 yards. "How is that possible?" the reporter asked. "Military experts I spoke to said that kind of accuracy at that range with iron sights is virtually impossible." Dalton was quiet for a moment. Sarah squeezed his hand, a silent gesture of support. "My father taught me to shoot when I was a boy," Dalton finally said. "Taught me to take my time, to make every shot count, to find the space between heartbeats where the shot is clean. The Army thought I was too slow, thought my methods were obsolete. Maybe they were right for most situations. But on November 8th, 1950, slow and careful was exactly what was needed." "Do you still have the rifle?" "No. I turned it in when I received a replacement weapon in January 1951. It's probably in a warehouse somewhere. Or it was scrapped. I don't know." "Would you want it back if it still exists?" Dalton smiled slightly. "No, it served its purpose. I served mine. We both came home, in a sense. That's enough." "Do you consider yourself a hero?" "No," Dalton said firmly. "I consider myself a soldier who did his job with the skills he had. Hundreds of thousands of men did the same thing in Korea. Many of them died doing it. I survived. That doesn't make me a hero. It makes me lucky." The article ran a week later on the front page of the local section. Local veterans classified heroism. Revealed. Lexington man defended position with WWI rifle. It was respectful and accurate, and it generated modest local interest. A few veterans groups asked Dalton to speak at their meetings. He politely declined. The Veterans of Foreign Wars post invited him to join. He accepted but rarely attended meetings. The Pentagon sent him a letter acknowledging the declassification and thanking him for his service. He filed it with his other papers and moved on with his life. He had no interest in being famous. He'd done what needed doing, survived, and come home to build a quiet life. That was enough. After the Korean War armistice in 1953, surplus weapons were collected, inventoried, and shipped back to the United States for storage or disposal. Springfield M1903 rifles were considered obsolete by this point. The Army had fully transitioned to the M1 Garand, and the M14 was in development. Most Springfields were either placed in long-term storage at ammunition depots or sold as surplus to civilian markets. Serial number 3287661 followed a different path. Master Sergeant Hensley, who'd processed Dalton's weapon exchange in January 1951, had made good on his word. He'd flagged the rifle in the system with a notation. Historical significance. See file 23 INF2 KOR 950 London 08. When the rifle returned to the United States in 1954, it was routed not to general surplus, but to a special holding facility at Anniston Army Depot in Alabama, where weapons with historical value were stored pending disposition decisions. There it sat, in a climate-controlled warehouse for 44 years. Occasionally, archivists or historians would review the holding facility's inventory, see the notation about historical significance, pull the classified file, read about Dalton's engagement, and conclude that the rifle should probably be preserved. But budget constraints, competing priorities, and the sheer volume of potentially historical items meant that no action was ever taken. The rifle remained in its rack, serial number tag attached, a brief notation in a database, the only evidence of its extraordinary history. In 1998, Dr. Ellen Zhao, a military historian at the University of Georgia, received a grant to research small unit actions during the Korean War. She was particularly interested in how individual soldiers adapted to unexpected combat situations using non-standard tactics or equipment. While reviewing declassified after-action reports at the National Archives, she encountered the November 8, 1950 engagement. The Dalton file immediately caught her attention, not because the numbers seemed impossible, though they did, but because the tactical situation was so unusual. A single soldier with an obsolete weapon achieving strategic effects, normally requiring a reinforced squad. She spent 6 months researching the engagement. She tracked down surviving members of Charlie Company, Kowalski, now 79 and living in Florida, Chen, 76, and living in California, Reeves, 78 and living in Arizona. She interviewed all of them extensively. Their stories matched. Every detail. After 48 years, their memories of that day remained vivid and consistent. It was the most remarkable thing I ever witnessed, Kowalski told her. And I served 26 years in the Army. I saw incredible acts of courage, skill, and determination. But what Jimmy Dalton did that day, that was beyond remarkable. That was impossible, made real. Zhao published her findings in the Journal of Military History in 2001. The article, titled Precision Over Volume, Individual Marksmanship in the Korean War, used Dalton's engagement as a case study in the value of diverse tactical approaches. The article caught the attention of the curator at the National Infantry Museum at Fort Benning, later moved to Fort Moore. The curator, reading Zhao's description of the Springfield rifle used in the engagement, checked the serial number against available databases and found it. Still sitting in storage at Anniston. In December 1998, a team from the National Infantry Museum traveled to Anniston Army Depot to retrieve serial number 32876X1. The rifle was in good condition. Some surface rust on the barrel, wear on the stock, but mechanically sound after 44 years in storage. The 15 notches carved into the stock were still visible, despite Dalton's objections at the time. The museum curator photographed them carefully, recognizing their historical significance, even though Dalton had disapproved. The rifle was professionally conserved, not restored to pristine condition, but preserved in its authentic state. The wear marks, the patina of use, the evidence of its hard service in Korea were all maintained. This was a working weapon with history, not a showpiece. The curator attempted to contact James Dalton to invite him to the dedication ceremony when the rifle would be placed on display. They found him still living in Kentucky, now 73 years old, retired, but healthy. Dalton declined to attend. "I appreciate the honor," he told the curator over the phone, "but that rifle represents a difficult time in my life. I'm glad it's being preserved for historical purposes, but I don't need to see it again." "Mr. Dalton, you're a legend," the curator pressed gently. Soldiers, study what you did. You proved that individual skill still matters. That obsolete doesn't mean useless. I proved that I got lucky, Dalton replied. I was in the right place with the right weapon at the right time, and I had the skills my father taught me. That's all. I'm not special. I'm just a man who survived when a lot of better men didn't. Would you at least provide a statement we could include with the display? Dalton was quiet for a moment. Then, all right, tell them this. Obsolete doesn't mean useless. Sometimes one perfect shot is worth 100 good ones. And the deadliest weapon in any war isn't the newest technology. It's a determined soldier who refuses to quit. The curator wrote it down word for word. The Springfield went on display in 1999. The exhibit included the rifle itself, period photographs from the Korean War, a map showing the Chongchon River Valley, excerpts from the after-action reports, and Dalton's statement. The main placard read, Springfield, M1903, rifle serial number 3287661, the obsolete weapon that stopped a battalion. On November 8, 1950, Corporal James Dalton used this rifle to defend his position against a Chinese battalion assault near the Chongchon River. Armed with a bolt-action rifle, considered obsolete by 1950 military standards, Dalton made 15 confirmed hits at ranges between 167 and 521 yards, disrupting enemy attack coordination and allowing friendly artillery to engage effectively. Military analysts later determined that Dalton's performance was statistically impossible, using conventional marksmanship theory. His achievement demonstrated that in the right circumstances, individual skill with appropriate weapons can achieve effects far beyond standard expectations. Corporal Dalton received the Silver Star for his actions. He returned home to Kentucky after the war and lived a quiet civilian life. When asked about his legendary shooting, he stated, "Obsolete doesn't mean useless. Sometimes one perfect shot is worth 100 good ones." Thousands of soldiers and civilians have viewed the rifle since 1999. Most pass by with minimal attention. It's just an old rifle, after all, nothing visually impressive compared to modern weapons systems. But some stop and read carefully. And they begin to understand that technology isn't everything. That sometimes the old ways work. That the warrior matters more than the weapon. In the years following the rifle's display, military training schools began using Dalton's story as a case study. Not as instruction in bolt-action rifle tactics, modern semi-automatic and automatic weapons are objectively superior for infantry combat, but as a lesson in adaptability, individual excellence, and the danger of rigid adherence to doctrine. The Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth incorporated the engagement into their curriculum on tactical flexibility. The lesson wasn't use old weapons, but rather recognize that diverse capabilities within units can provide options when standard approaches fail. The Army Marksmanship Unit used Dalton's story to emphasize fundamentals over technology. Corporal Dalton didn't have the best equipment, instructors would tell students. He had the best fundamentals: breathing control, trigger discipline, wind reading, range estimation. Those skills matter regardless of weapon system. Master the fundamentals, and you can excel with any weapon. Competitive shooting organizations studied the engagement, trying to understand how Dalton had achieved such precision under combat stress. Sports psychologists has analyzed the mental discipline required to maintain focus while under fire. Ballistics experts studied the external factors: wind, temperature, elevation. that Dalton had intuitively compensated for. But no one could replicate his performance. Under controlled conditions, with unlimited time and no stress, expert marksmen could approach his accuracy at those ranges. But in combat conditions, with a 4-minute time limit, while being shot at, no one came close. A 2005 analysis by the American Sniper Association concluded, Corporal Dalton's performance represents the absolute apex of what a skilled marksman can achieve with iron sight weapons under adverse conditions. It has never been matched, and likely never will be, as the specific combination of natural ability, lifetime training, environmental factors, and tactical necessity required to replicate it is effectively impossible to recreate deliberately. James Dalton lived to see the 21st century. He watched his children grow and succeed. Robert became a teacher, like his mother. Elizabeth became a nurse. Thomas worked in construction, all three married, had children of their own, and gave Jimmy and Sarah 7 grandchildren. Jimmy watched the world change. He saw America fight in the Gulf War, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. He watched weapons technology advance from bolt-action rifles to smart bombs and drone strikes. He watched warfare itself transform into something his father wouldn't have recognized. Robert, following family tradition, enlisted in the Army in 1972 and served in Vietnam. He came home in 1973, quieter and harder, carrying his own war. A father and son never discussed their combat experiences in detail, but there was an understanding between them, a recognition that they'd both walked through fire. "Did you ever regret it?" Robert asked his father one evening in 1998, the two of them sitting on the back porch watching the sun set over the Kentucky hills. "The war, I mean. What you did." Jimmy was quiet for a long time. "I regret the war," he finally said. "I regret that it had to happen, that young men had to die, that the world couldn't find a better way to resolve its problems." He paused. "But I don't regret what I did that day. I saved lives. Chen, Vance, Reeves, they lived because of those shots. That has to mean something." "The museum wants to feature your rifle," Robert said. "I got a call from them. They want you to attend the ceremony." "I know." I told them no. "Why?" "Because I don't want to celebrate killing," Jimmy said. "Even enemy soldiers. Even in war. Those 15 men I shot, they had families, probably. Mothers, fathers, maybe wives and children. They were just doing what their government told them to do, same as me. I don't regret pulling the trigger, because I'd do it again to save my friends. But I'm not going to stand in front of cameras and be praised for it." Robert understood. He'd felt the same after Vietnam. In 2005, a researcher from the Army's marksmanship unit tracked Jimmy down, wanting to study his technique for a training manual. Jimmy was 80 years old by then, his hands not as steady as they'd once been, his eyesight fading. "I can't show you anything useful," he told the researcher. "I'm old. I haven't fired a rifle in 20 years. And honestly, I'm not sure I could explain how I did it even if I wanted to." "Sir, we don't need you to demonstrate. We just need to understand your mental process. How did you compensate for wind at 500 yards with iron sights?" Jimmy smiled. "I didn't compensate. I felt it. My father taught me to feel the wind, to understand it instinctively rather than calculate it mathematically. You can't teach that in a classroom. You learn it by spending years hunting in the mountains, by firing thousands of rounds in all conditions, by growing up in a place where missing meant going hungry. So it can't be replicated?" Not the way I did it, Jimmy admitted. You can teach the mechanics, breathing, trigger control, sight picture. But the intuition, the feel, that comes from a lifetime of experience that most modern soldiers won't have. They'll develop their own intuition with their own weapons, but my way, that died with the bolt-action rifle era. The researcher left unsatisfied, but Jimmy had told him the truth. James Dalton died peacefully in his sleep on March 3, 2007, at the age of 82. He'd lived a full life: husband, father, grandfather, veteran, worker, teacher. He'd been decorated for valor, studied by historians, and preserved in museums. But he'd never let any of that define him. He was Jimmy Dalton from Kentucky, son of Robert, taught to shoot in the mountains, called to war, came home, lived quiet. That was enough. His funeral was attended by family, friends, and 3 elderly men who'd traveled from across the country. Chen, now 78, using a cane from the leg wound that never fully healed. Reeves, 80, still sharp despite his years. And Kowalski, 85. Frail, but determined to pay his respects. They stood together at the graveside, 3 old men who remembered a frozen valley, a desperate fight, and the impossible shots that saved their lives. After the service, Kowalski approached Robert. "Your father was the best soldier I ever served with," he said, his voice rough with age and emotion. "And I served with thousands." "He never talked about the war much," Robert replied. "Just said he did his job and came home." "That sounds like Jimmy." Kowalski smiled sadly. "But I need you to know something. What your father did on November 8th, 1950, it wasn't just good shooting. It was impossible shooting. Military analysts studied it for years and couldn't explain it. Your father changed the course of a battle with a rifle everyone said was worthless." "Did it matter?" Robert asked. "In the big picture, I mean." "It mattered to me," Kowalski said quietly. "It mattered to Chen, who's alive because your father shot the man about to kill him. It mattered to Reeves and 17 other men who lived through that day. The big picture is made of small moments, son. Your father's moment was one that mattered." The Springfield M1903, serial number 3287661, remains on display at the National Infantry Museum. In 2008, following Dalton's death, the museum updated the exhibit to include photographs from his funeral, his obituary, and a memorial wreath donated by the surviving members of Charlie Company. The rifle stands as a testament to a simple truth: obsolete doesn't mean useless. Every year, thousands of soldiers in training visit the museum. Most learn about modern weapons systems, the M4 carbine, night vision, advanced targeting systems. But their instructors always stop at Dalton's rifle. Always tell the story. Always emphasize the lesson. Technology matters. Training matters. Doctrine matters. But sometimes, the warrior matters most of all. Today, competitive shooters occasionally attempt to replicate Dalton's performance. Using period-accurate Springfield 1903 rifles with iron sights, shooting at man-sized targets at 400 to 500 yards, trying to match his hit rate. No one has succeeded. Even in ideal conditions, no stress, no time limit, unlimited ammunition to practice, the best marksmen struggle to consistently hit at those ranges with iron sights. What Dalton accomplished in combat, under fire, in 4 minutes, remains beyond the capability of even Olympic-level shooters. He must have had some physical advantage, one competitive shooter concluded. Better vision, steadier hands, something we don't understand. Because what he did violates everything we know about human limits. Maybe, or maybe he was just a Kentucky boy who learned to shoot from his father, who spent his childhood hungry if he missed, who understood that between heartbeats is where the perfect shot lives. Maybe he was just a soldier who refused to change, who stayed true to his training even when everyone said it was wrong, who trusted his father's teaching more than the Army's doctrine. Maybe he was just lucky. Right place, right weapon, right moment. Or maybe he was something more. Not superhuman, but perfectly human. A man who took everything he'd learned, everything he'd been taught, everything he believed in, and in one desperate moment applied it with absolute precision and saved lives. The Springfield sits in its display case, silent witness to an impossible day. The plaque tells the story in sanitized terms, confirmed hits, measured distances, tactical outcomes. But the real story is simpler. One man, one rifle, one perfect moment when obsolete became essential, when slow became perfect, when everything became legendary. No one ever mocked him again. His weapon was ancient, but his legend is eternal.